Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Shrink Think. I am Chelli Pumphrey, and I am a licensed professional counselor and specialist in treating narcissistic abuse survivors. And with me, we have Sandra Brown. Sandra, do you want to introduce yourself?
I am Sandra Brown. We are with the Association for MPD and Psychopathy Survivor Treatment, Research, and Education. And we bring to you this video series on common errors in coaching and treating survivors of narcissistic abuse.
Thank you. So for those of you that have been following our last video, in the last video, we were talking about super traits. And so today we wanted to go in and focus on, we'll do a little bit more of an in-depth focus on the super traits of agreeableness and conscientiousness. So we're going to break it down for you so that you can get a really good understanding of what this looks like and how we get confused, or how there are these misperceptions out there about why survivors get tangled up in these relationships with narcissists, and in particular, why it often looks like people are just codependent. So I wanted to just kind of start with, why it's important to talk about or to understand this aspect of personality. And I know for me, it was an eye-opener as a clinician when I really started looking at it through this lens, because personality is so all-encompassing. It's such a foundation of who we are in the world and how we view things. It affects our emotions, our behavior, our thoughts, everything. So it's really important to understand if a survivor, like most survivors, we know at least 63% based on a study that was done, have these traits of agreeableness and conscientiousness. So I'm going to pause right there. Sandra, I'll let you chime in and share what you'd like to share from here.
Okay, so as you referenced, the last video, we did sort of a little intro into it by comparing and contrasting super traits of personality with codependency. And one of the reasons we did that is one of the common treatment errors is that they are often called codependent. And it's part of why we did the research with Purdue University, because despite everyone assuming that about them, many of them were in codependency groups and CODA meetings for years. And it never addressed the real issue they had going on, which was not codependency. So that last video was sort of a lead-in to talk a little bit about getting specific on the super traits. And so, as you said, personality is really important in this work, probably more so than maybe other genres of counseling, because understanding personality is primary because it's active in both sides of the relational dynamic. For instance, the partner's personality pathology. So we have to understand personality to understand the personality disorders of the partner. And also because of the survivor's personality. And we should understand personality anyway, because we all have one. And I've talked about that for a lot of therapists. I don't know about you, but I was trying to remember back when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, and I was in graduate school, what kind of training and personality I had. I think back then in the 90s, it was like personality assessment. What did you have?
Yeah, I feel like that was it. I mean, it was really I mean, there was so little of a focus that I don't even remember.
Yeah,
It just was not, it was like, let's just do the 101 understanding of it, and that was it.
I think it was kind of a general overview, and maybe a little bit on like extroversion and introversion.
Yeah.
And so, you know, personality has been sort of I think, a sleeper science, in that it's really only gained some popularity, and we're starting to see things that as therapists we can actually use coming out probably over the last 15 years. And so most of us, head into this treatment issue that is very personality based, with an archaic one class, a million years ago. And then we get plopped into working with survivors of pathological relationships where personality has such a huge influence.
Yeah.
And I think that, we're behind the 8 ball with that. And obviously, from what we can see out on the internet, it doesn't appear that a lot of therapists are talking about personality, the personality, pathology of the partner or the survivor. So when we were designing the treatment manual, we identified one of the areas that therapists needed more training in was this issue about personality. And like I said, as personality science is becoming a bigger thing, there's a lot it really can offer to us, especially those of us working in pathological relationships. So I imagine, and I think a lot of therapists are surprised about how much this is personality oriented.
Right.
Were you when you first read the work?
Oh, 100%. I mean, it just really changed my perception of it, because I think and some of this might have been the population that I've worked with over time. But I think I saw trauma, and I always, as a trauma therapist, was always looking back to, okay, what layers of trauma led up to this person, kind of through this codependent lens. How did this person become a codependent person to get in these relationships? So I was still seeing a lot of it through that lens, but I also knew from my own personal experience, it didn't fit for me. And I knew many survivors that didn't fit either. So
Yeah.
in my brain, with my limited knowledge of personality, it wasn't until I saw this work that it really clicked for me that, oh, yes. And it really makes sense too, because we spend so much time looking at the personality of the narcissist or the antisocial or psychopath, but we're not looking at the personality of the survivors, and that why, it's like these dark parts, the dangerous parts of these types here draw this, we focus our attention on it because it's so bad, but we forget to look at these other parts, which when we look at agreeableness or conscientiousness, they're actually very pro-social, wonderful aspects of a personality. And somehow we just, this gets all the attention. So I am I just, yeah, this is so important for us to be able to understand.
And while I think a lot of therapists think that they are understanding personality because they post a lot about the behaviors generated from the personality disorder, they still really aren't talking about personality.
Yes.
You see all these memes out there. Granted, a lot of them are by non-clinicals, the narcissist does this, and this, and he says this, and he gaslights, and we stay all external,
Right.
on the behaviors without really talking about the maladaptiveness that came from, personality development. And I see therapists not, talking about really the aspects of personality. They talk about the external manifestations of the bad behavior.
Mhm.
And consequently, we aren't teaching survivors any more deeply about how personality disorders develop than bloggers or non-professionals are teaching. And
Right.
so while we think we are talking about personality disorders, a lot of time they're never talking about personality.
Right.
And I think that's an educational misstep, because one of the things that when we did our Finding Competent Care that survivors said they needed that they were not getting out there was the psychoeducation on personality disorders, how they develop, not just the nurture theory of the sad story of woe from childhood, but the nature theory related to neuroscience and neurobiology, which is all part of personality again,
Right.
and sort of highlighting what has changed from when we got our graduate course is this explosion of information on the neuroscience and neurobiology of personality disorders and how helpful that can be to survivors in psychoeducation. So with that said, the importance of better personality science training for all of us, let's jump into what we found about the super traits of personality. So before you flip that up there, I'm just going to say a couple words about what you're going to be looking at on the screen in a minute. So I ended up doing a research project with Purdue University because my training had been in psychopathology, but it had also been in trauma. And so I approached these survivors through the lens of trauma also. And I automatically assumed that they had adverse childhoods. And so I began to, approach treatment through that trauma lens. And over the course of a number of years, lots of my survivors from PLRs did not have a historical history of trauma. And I couldn't figure out what was probably leading them into these relationships if it was not bad childhood and repeating patterns of violence or abnormal types of partners. So, after you get dozens and dozens of clients that don't meet the typical profile of what we expect with historical trauma, then you start asking yourself, well, what other kinds of influences can there be if it was not adverse childhoods? And so that's when I approached Purdue and I said, I want to look at personality because I felt like what's left to look at. And so the outcomes of this, we tested over 600 women, which is a pretty big, sample size. And the commonalities were not their history, because some had adverse histories and some did not. What a large portion of them had in common were these elevated personality traits. So if you want to pop that up on the screen.
Here we go.
Ooh,
Okay.
I'm gonna have to put my glasses on for that one.
Let's see if I can make it a little bigger here and all my. Okay, well, for some reason this doesn't want to get bigger, but
All right, we'll just work with it.
I'll work on it while you start talking.
All right, so the Purdue study looked at all aspects of personality, measured using the 5-factor model, which looks at the 5 dimensions of personality. So they tested all of them to see if any were too high or too low. And on the bell curve, the top of the bell curve is what we call the safety zone, or the sweet spot, where we like to see most of the traits fall. If they're too on a bell curve, if they're too far down this way or they're too far down this way, on the ends of the bell curve is where pathology is denoted. They have too little of something or too much of something. So so the survivors were not down at the bell curve. I think a lot of times, survivors have told us that therapists have assumed they're borderline because they ended up in these relationships. So we wanted to look at that. Are they falling way down here in the bell curve? They did not fall down. Majority of them did not fall in pathological areas. They were up at the top of the bell curve, where we like to see them, but they were a little, one toe over the line, a little over the sweet spot into what is called the high normal area. And I think the interesting thing about personality science, and it being a sleeper science, is that the vast majority of researchers in personality have only been studying the low down here. They always study the psychopathology ends of it. And the reason I think Purdue was interested is because this was studying normal people with a little tweak, a little too high in these traits. And I don't think that there had been a lot of study about normal people with a couple of elevated factors and what that can do, because they spent millions of dollars studying psychopaths and personality, not us normal people that have a little too high. So we entered in to look and see in all 5 domains where these people fell, and if there was anything significant that might help explain why they got into these relationships and why it was so difficult to disengage. And so, as they say, the rest was history, and I think this produced a lot of information for us. So one interesting thing about that study, and if I ever have time, to go back and write more about this, is that they had a little bit of trait elevations in all 5 domains. But the two that we hyper focused on that we think were very pertinent to getting targeted and getting in these relationships and difficult getting out were the traits of agreeable and conscientiousness. But just as a note, they did have slight elevations in other areas too. But today we're going to talk about this trait of agreeableness. And maybe you want to take that first one, Rita. You can probably see it better than I can.
With trust.
Yeah.
So trusting of others and trustworthy, optimistic about human nature, sees others through who she is. Now, I mean, clearly this is one of the biggest hurdles, or one of the biggest things I see that get us into these relationships. Way too trusting. You see the good part in a person, you want to see the good part of a person or be optimistic about their nature. And I mean, truly, this is one of the biggest, what I like to call these, in my book, I called it internal red flags. And it's like where we need to know what our own red flag is, just generally speaking. Like, it is a red flag that I have a trusting nature, as part of my agreeableness personality trait. And so I always need to be aware of that and getting into any relationship. That's kind of how I like to see it.
Yeah. And so the trait of agreeableness, everything that we're going to talk about, I don't know if we'll get through all of them or not. These are all facets that make up this overarching trait of agreeableness. And so Chelli just talked about one of the facets is the issue of trust. And one thing that people need to know, this is not a checklist. You're not picking and choosing, yes, that applies to me. No, that doesn't apply. All of these facets make up the trait of agreeableness. So you're not picking and choosing. These are all parts of agreeableness. And this trust issue for clinicians, you need to understand that, personality as innate is that our personality is the most stable part of our psyche. And so just like we know in personality disorders, there's not a whole bunch you're going to do to make that personality different after it's developed, whether it's developed maladaptively or relatively normal. Personality is stable. And so this issue of trust, being naturally, innately, trusting, becomes a treatment issue and a risk factor throughout life. Because they take their personality to the next relationship. Have they learned a couple things from being in this relationship? Yes, but if we're not working with them on their own natural, hardwired personality proclivity, that you will always have a tendency to lean into this hyper trust, then we're missing the opportunity for them to have a greater agency or ability to consciously watch themselves, check themselves about this issue of trust.
Yes.
And so in the beginning, they're so hyper focused on the trust in the relationship that they have a hard time expanding until later in treatment, the ability to see this issue about trust in other areas. And later in treatment, when we really begin working with personality proclivities, when their trauma is reduced, and their cognitive dissonance is reduced, and their bandwidth is wider, where they can actually think and work on some stuff, we really hone in on working with these personality proclivities where they can expand their view and see themselves in action and giving out too much trust, maybe with their employer or friend or family, because it is, as an innate factor, it's going to be active everywhere. Is there a particular way that you highlight, for instance, that issue of trust with survivors in treatment?
Well, I think just kind of, what kind of going back to what I had said initially is for them to know that like to really understand that. And I think what I try to help them see is, when that is part of your personality, it is literally the lens that you see the world through. And so it is extremely difficult to imagine the world in a different way. It is just
Right.
our go-to. So as therapists, when we are working with survivors, this isn't just one conversation. This is like something that needs to be kind of chipped away at all the time to help them understand that this is just, it's just how they are. And so they really need to understand that the world is not full of optimism. And God, that sounds so dark and bad, but learning how to apply that in their relationships to keep them safe. Maybe I should just say it that way.
Yeah.
And it really is ongoing work that you need to do to help them understand that, because there's just not a different frame of reference.
Right.
And it could be any other way.
Yeah. And personality being so innate, we don't sit around and think about our personality.
Right.
They become very aware of it
Yeah.
after a pathological relationship, because they're like, oh my God, I don't want this to ever happen again. But leading up to that, no one sits around and thinks about their personality unless maybe they have horrible introversion, where they're so shy it's painful.
Right.
And in that case, they may have some insight about their personality. But we got to know that 99% of these people heading into this we all come out with whatever our personality is, and it is the lens through which we see the world. And so having to now operate in the world with a whole lot of awareness about your personality is a horrendous shift. And if,
Right.
like you said, this is actually a big part of the second half of treatment, is helping them to almost develop what we would call an observing witness. The ability to be outside of oneself and watch these risky traits operate with other people. And it's hard. It is hard work. They talk about it's so much work to pay attention to how this trait or facet of trust is operating. And it is, because that's why so often they talk about you're not really going to fully ever change a personality. We can become aware of parts, and for normal people, they're motivated to become aware of parts, and they're motivated to work with that. Where in personality disorders, there's no motivation and no consistency with it. But this issue of trust is, I think, once therapists begin to see these facets at work, will really can jump in there and point this out to survivors. So as you said, trusting of others, and they are also very trustworthy. And this optimism about human nature is problematic, and them not wanting to think badly of other people. And it's almost a form of projection, that they project their
Right.
own trustworthiness onto other people that they don't know from Adam, really.
Mhm. Yeah, totally.
And one of the interesting factors about this issue of trust is the difference between blind trust and conditional trust. And this is something therapists can use psychoeducationally with them and point out in action as it's happening either in this prior relationship or with other people, that in this issue and this elevation of trust is that these survivors tend to operate from blind trust.
Yeah.
And that is, I always call it like a credit card of trust. Here's my credit card. I don't know you from Adam, but here's all my trust. And after you violate it 500 times, then I might remove it. Whereas in conditional trust, most people who do not have higher levels of agreeableness naturally in their personality operate out of conditional trust. People earn trust, and they earn it repeatedly by being consistent.
Right.
And the survivors have such a hard time embracing that as a concept when you show them, when you talk to them about blind trust and conditional trust, about shifting to conditional trust. And I've had them like hold their head and say, this is like metal twisting in my head, to shift from just automatically blind trust into conditional trust.
Mhm.
And as therapists, seeing that would often assume that blind trust was generated out of codependency instead of an innate feature.
Yes. Yes. Good point.
Yeah, and so just that one facet of trust, you could I've worked with people pointing that out in session, even a year after I had been working with them, when that would pop up, and I could see them leading with blind trust instead of sort of chaperoning and paying attention to that and shifting into conditional trust. And like you said, it's, it comes up throughout treatment. This is not a one-time thing, but by the way, you have blind trust, don't do that anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's cover one more, and then we'll probably wrap it up, and we'll have to come back and get into the next.
Okay.
And what's the next one?
The straightforwardness,
Yeah.
upfront, honest, and confiding.
Yeah. So maybe you can relate this to, and if you've seen this in your work, that issue about upfront, honest, and confiding,
Right.
which often leads to over disclosure.
Yes. Yeah, I think this one is, again, this is, these, as you'll see as we go through this list how everything's interconnected, because this really kind of comes in to play with the trust aspect. Like, if I trust this person, it's fine to give out my information. It just, using your metaphor of the credit card, like, especially if we look at broadening the metaphor these days, you don't give out your social security number and all this identifying information, but somebody that has the straightforward part of them who trusts easily think that a few dates in, it's okay to give this information because they're good. You see that. And so it can, it looks like oversharing, based on this is a good person, and having no idea of what it might mean to slowly disclose things as they've earned the right to know these things about you. And I think the thing that is really concerning about this is that when you have a personality disordered, predatorial person who is listening for these things, they are taking all of these bits of information from the survivor as she's just innocently disclosing, and that is used to mirror them. It is used to suck them in to the relationship, and later on down the line to, I mean, depending on the level of psychopathology that we're dealing with, any of that information can be used in ways to manipulate, harm, intimidate, or keep a person trapped in the relationship.
Right. And it might not even be her offering that an over disclosure. They also, fish for that information to create, that sense of soulmate status, types of attachment, the instant connection kind of thing. And again, in our shift away from thinking only from historical trauma to innate personality, is that this could be happening not because she had a history and that she's doing this out of some desperate necessity of connection, but just as an innate reaction. These are just really straightforward people. You ask them something, they're gonna tell you. That's what makes them delightful to be with. There's no game playing. They're just upfront.
Yeah.
And this becomes an issue that we have to work with later on, and when they heal their trauma and get enough treatment and they begin to date again, is about again having to chaperone or be the observing witness to what their innate personality naturally would want to do. They would naturally,
Right.
the guy says, are you divorced? Did you have a bad marriage or whatever? Their natural inclination is to be honest and straight. Yes, it was terrible, it was terrible. It was this or that. He hit me. He stole all my money, that kind of thing. That's their natural inclination.
Yeah.
And how for them with these personality proclivities, it's not how they can lead in dating, and that there's actually, very different parameters we set for them in dating than their girlfriend who doesn't have blind trust and, straightforwardness. And so there's some risk factors here that we're constantly, I think, working with to prepare them out there in the world with the personality that they have.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I think, so the video doesn't go too long. We'll stop there and we'll pick up next time. So thank you for joining us today on Super Traits and the Trait of Agreeableness.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.